The courtroom was still, but it wasn't the usual silence of respect. It was the kind of silence that envelops the room when something unexpected happens, something truly shocking. It wasn't just the weight of the moment, it was the absurdity of it. Michael "Mike" Donovan, a tall, rugged ex-convict, leaned back in his seat with a smirk that sent a ripple of unease through the room. His laughter, deep and booming, broke the silence, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. It wasn't a nervous chuckle or a brief, awkward laugh. It was full and mocking, like he couldn't believe he was in this situation. Gasps spread like wildfire. His old friends, his so-called BFFs, shifted in their seats, exchanging nervous glances. The prosecutor, a man who had spent weeks carefully constructing a case, stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. His mind couldn't catch up with the chaos in front of him. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman named Judge Victoria Hayes, had turned crimson. Her hands gripped the gavel so tightly her knuckles turned white, and her lips pressed together in a thin line. The tension in the room was suffocating. "Excuse me?" Judge Hayes's voice rumbled through the room, low and dangerous like a storm approaching. But Michael didn't stop laughing. If anything, the sound of his amusement grew louder, his shoulders shaking with the force of it. "Oh, that's rich," he muttered under his breath, wiping a mock tear from his eye. "You really think this is going to work?" "Enough," the judge roared, slamming the gavel down with such force that the courtroom seemed to shake. "I will not tolerate this level of disrespect." Michael's smirk remained. He wasn't afraid. He was beyond it. But he should have been. Because what happened next was brutal. 3 months ago, this same man, Michael Donovan, had been locked away in a small, suffocating cell, counting down the days until his release. He had spent 6 long years in prison, and not a single day went by that he didn't think about what had gotten him there. The world outside had moved on without him. His mother, the only person who had ever truly believed in him, had passed away while he was behind bars. His little sister, Emma, had grown into a young woman he barely recognized. And the city of New York? It had turned into something even colder than he remembered. The streets no longer felt like home. He was released with nothing more than a bag of cheap clothes, a few dollars in his pocket, and a criminal record that followed him like a shadow. Every job interview ended the same way: polite rejection or a vague excuse. People whispered behind his back, pointing fingers. "That's Michael Donovan," they'd murmur. "He's the guy who—" Michael never waited to hear the rest. He tried to keep his head down. He tried to walk the straight path, but the world wasn't interested in second chances. One night, while walking down an empty street, minding his own business, Michael heard a scream. A woman's scream. Desperate. Terrified. His first instinct was to keep walking. It wasn't his problem. People never looked out for him, so why should he look out for them? But something inside him twisted. He couldn't just ignore it. Turning the corner, he saw a man gripping a woman's arm, trying to drag her into an alley. Her purse was on the ground, and her face was twisted in terror. Michael's blood ran cold. He didn't think. He acted. "Hey!" Michael shouted, his voice cutting through the night. The attacker spun around, startled. Michael saw the flicker of hesitation in his eyes. "Walk away," the man growled, trying to intimidate him. But Michael wasn't backing down. The next few seconds were a blur. The attacker lunged, but Michael had been in enough fights to know how to defend himself. He dodged, countered, and before he knew it, the man was lying on the ground, groaning in pain. The woman scrambled to her feet, shaking, and stammered a thank you. Michael nodded, already backing away. The last thing he needed was the police showing up. But he wasn't fast enough. A siren wailed in the distance, and a few minutes later, he found himself in handcuffs again. The police didn't care about what had really happened. They only saw one thing: Michael Donovan, ex-convict, standing over an injured man. And now, here he was, back in court, facing another judge, facing the system once more. That was why he laughed. Because this world was a joke. No matter what he did, he would always be seen as the criminal. But he had no idea what was about to happen next. Judge Hayes glared at him, her eyes narrowing with fury. "You think this is funny, Mr. Donovan?" she demanded. Michael didn't answer. He just held her gaze, waiting for her to calm down. The tension in the room thickened. "Very well," Judge Hayes said, leaning forward, her voice tight with anger. "If you find this situation amusing, let's see if you're still laughing after my ruling." And then the doors burst open. A figure rushed in, breathless, waving a piece of paper in the air. "Your Honor, you need to see this," the person shouted. Michael turned slowly, his heart pounding. Something was happening. Something unexpected. And whatever it was, he had no idea if it would save him or destroy him. The woman who had burst into the courtroom was out of breath, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She looked around the room, eyes wide with panic, before locking eyes with Michael. Her hands trembled as she held out a piece of paper to the judge. Michael couldn't make sense of what was happening. His mind was spinning. He'd been through too much in his life to be fooled by coincidences. Judge Hayes frowned, clearly caught off guard by this sudden interruption. But she held her tongue for a moment, allowing the woman to approach her. She glanced down at the paper with the same unreadable expression she had worn since the trial began. The room was silent, every person in the courtroom holding their breath, waiting for the next move. "Who are you?" Judge Hayes demanded. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the tense atmosphere. The woman took a deep breath and replied, "My name is Julia Barrett, and I have evidence that proves Michael Donovan is innocent." She barely managed to keep her voice steady. She was clearly nervous, but there was an undeniable conviction in her eyes. The prosecutor, who had been standing at the front of the room with his arms crossed, rolled his eyes in disbelief. "This is highly unorthodox," he muttered, shaking his head. "We cannot accept random, unsolicited evidence in the middle of a trial." "Enough," the judge interrupted, raising a hand. "Miss Barrett, you will approach the bench and present what you have." Her voice was firm, but there was a hint of curiosity hidden behind her usual stern demeanor. Julia walked forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She handed the piece of paper to Judge Hayes, her hands visibly shaking as she did so. Michael watched her closely. He didn't recognize her, at least not in the way he expected. But something about the urgency in her eyes felt familiar. Judge Hayes unfolded the paper and scanned it quickly. The tension in the room only thickened as she read, her brow furrowing in concentration. Then her gaze shifted toward Michael. "What is this?" she asked, her voice now tinged with uncertainty. Julia's voice was quieter now, almost a whisper. "It's proof that Michael Donovan isn't guilty of the crimes he's been accused of. He didn't do it." The room erupted into murmurs. Some people exchanged looks of disbelief. Others were plainly confused. The prosecutor, however, was having none of it. "That's absurd," he snapped, slamming a hand onto the table. "Mr. Donovan was found at the scene of the crime. He was standing over the so-called victim. He has a criminal record a mile long, and no one else was there to witness what happened. We've gone over this already." Julia's jaw tightened, but she stood her ground. "You're wrong. There were witnesses. And that man," she pointed to the prosecutor, "is lying about the events that night." The prosecutor scoffed. "Witnesses? You expect me to believe that? Yes, Julia replied, her voice growing more confident. Because I was there. I saw everything. The room fell silent again. Michael felt a rush of disbelief course through him. She was claiming to be a witness? He didn't know her, and yet she was stepping in to save him. There was no way this was just coincidence. The judge, still clearly processing the situation, narrowed her eyes at Julia. You were there? You saw the entire incident? Julia nodded. Yes. I was walking home when I saw the attack take place. Michael didn't start it. He ended it. He saved that woman's life. The prosecutor snorted. You expect us to believe that? If you were there, why didn't you come forward sooner? Julia hesitated for a moment, her gaze flickering nervously to the floor, before meeting the judges again. I was scared, she admitted. I didn't know what to do, but I couldn't just let an innocent man go to jail for something he didn't do. Michael's heart skipped a beat as he listened to her words. For the first time since his release from prison, he began to feel a sliver of hope. But there was still something nagging at him. Why had she waited so long to speak up? Why had she kept quiet for so long? Judge Hayes studied Julia carefully, her fingers steepled together. Miss Barrett, she said, her tone more thoughtful now, you've just presented some highly important information. But before we proceed, I must ask you to provide more details. Mr. Donovan, do you know this woman? Michael shook his head slowly. Never seen her before in my life, he said, his voice steady. Julia looked between them, almost as though she was expecting that response. She opened her mouth to say something more, but before she could speak, a loud crash echoed through the courtroom. The door to the back of the room slammed open once again, and another figure rushed in. It was a man, tall, with a hard expression, and a dark suit. He was flanked by another man who was bruised, his face battered and swollen, his clothes disheveled. Michael's stomach twisted. He recognized the man immediately. It was the same man he had fought in the alley that night, the one he had helped the woman escape from. But now, seeing him up close, Michael could tell something was wrong. The bruises on the man's face weren't from that fight. They were new, fresh. The man in the dark suit stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the room as if assessing the situation. Your Honor, we need to speak with Mr. Donovan, he said, his voice smooth but laced with something colder. The judge narrowed her eyes at him. Who are you? I'm Agent Daniel Reed of the FBI, he replied, flashing a badge with a controlled yet unnerving confidence. And I'm here because Mr. Donovan is involved in something much bigger than this case. The words hit Michael like a ton of bricks. His gut twisted with an icy dread. FBI? What did the federal government have to do with his case? He had thought this was just a petty legal battle, one more fight in the endless string of misfortune he had lived through. But now it seemed like he was caught up in something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. The room fell into an oppressive silence. Michael could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, as if they were waiting for him to react. His hands clenched into fists. What was this about? Why was the FBI involved now? Michael's mind was racing, his thoughts scattering like leaves in a storm. The FBI. This had gone way beyond anything he had expected. He'd known the streets of New York like the back of his hand. He'd survived a tough life, learned to fight, learned to survive. But this was different. The fact that the federal government was now involved meant there were much larger forces at play, and Michael had no idea what role he was supposed to play in it. Agent Daniel Reed, a tall man with a hard, almost cruel expression, stepped forward with a confidence that only someone used to holding power in a room could muster. Your Honor, he said, his voice icy. "This isn't just about a simple assault. Mr. Donovan has caught the attention of a much more dangerous group. We need to question him further about his involvement in a series of high-profile crimes." The prosecutor, who had been visibly struggling to maintain control of the situation, stood up straighter now. "What crimes are you referring to, Agent Reed?" he asked, his tone defensive, as if he was trying to assert control over the room again. Reed didn't answer immediately, but his cold eyes scanned the courtroom. "I'll need Mr. Donovan's cooperation," he said, turning toward Michael, "for the safety of everyone involved." Michael didn't respond. His mind was too busy replaying the events of the night he'd tried to help that woman in the alley. He had thought it was a simple act of heroism. What he didn't realize was that this one small act had just dragged him into the kind of mess he couldn't have possibly imagined. The FBI wasn't involved in petty street fights, and they certainly wouldn't be looking into an ex-convict like him unless there was something far bigger at play. He remembered it clearly, the night of the incident in the alleyway. It had started out so simply. He had been walking home, just another ordinary evening in the city. But that night, he had heard the scream. A woman's scream, desperate and full of fear. For a split second, he had ignored it, rationalizing that it wasn't his problem. But then, something inside him twisted, and before he could even think about it, he had turned the corner. What he saw made his blood run cold. A man had the woman by the arm, trying to drag her into an alley. The woman's face was twisted in terror, and her purse was discarded on the ground. The sight was enough to jolt him into action. Without thinking, Michael shouted at the man, trying to startle him into letting go. But the attacker had just turned, his eyes narrowing as he saw Michael. "Walk away," the man had growled, his voice thick with menace. Michael's gut told him this wasn't just some petty street robbery. It was something much darker. The attacker had advanced on him, and Michael wasn't going to back down. He clenched his fists, taking a step forward. The next few seconds were a blur. Michael had been in enough fights to know how to handle himself, but this time he wasn't fighting for himself. He was fighting to protect someone else. The man lunged, and Michael dodged. He countered quickly, catching the attacker off guard. The man hit the ground with a painful thud, groaning as he lay on the sidewalk. The woman, still shaken but visibly relieved, scrambled to her feet. "Thank you," she stammered, her voice weak from fear. Michael simply nodded, backing away. He didn't want the police involved. The last thing he needed was to get dragged into another mess, especially after everything he'd been through. But he wasn't fast enough. The sirens came screaming from the distance, and in a matter of minutes, he was in handcuffs again. As the police arrived, they didn't care about the truth. They didn't care that he had intervened to stop a crime. All they saw was a man with a criminal record standing over another injured man. And that was enough to send him straight back to court, with no chance to explain his side. Now, sitting in the courtroom, Michael couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. For 6 years, he had tried to escape his past, tried to prove that he wasn't the same person he had been when he was locked up. But here he was, right back in the system again. No matter what he did, he couldn't escape the labels that had been slapped on him. He was still a criminal in the eyes of everyone around him, even though he had done the right thing. It wasn't just a joke. It was a cruel joke. A joke that made him feel more trapped than he ever had before. And now, with the FBI stepping in, he had no idea what they wanted from him. The man who had been in the alley that night, the so-called victim, was lying. Michael knew that much. The bruises on his face were too fresh to have come from the fight he and Michael had. Someone had beaten him up, and Michael could guess who that someone was. But why? Why was he being dragged into this larger conspiracy? Agent Reed seemed to read Michael's thoughts, stepping forward again with an air of authority. "You're involved in something much bigger than this, Mr. Donovan. You don't even realize how deep this goes." He spoke as if Michael were already guilty of something. Michael hated it. Before he could say anything, the doors to the courtroom burst open again. This time, two men in dark suits entered, their expressions cold and calculating. Michael's stomach twisted when he saw the bruised man from the alleyway following them. The man's injuries were far worse than anything Michael had done to him that night. This wasn't just an act of random violence. It was something else, something planned. One of the men in the suits stepped forward. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, flashing a badge, "we need to talk about Mr. Donovan." Judge Hayes turned sharply to the man. "Who are you?" "I'm Special Agent James Carter, FBI," the man replied. His voice was firm and authoritative, but it sent a chill down Michael's spine. He didn't know what to think anymore. Agent Reed stepped back, giving Agent Carter room to speak. "We have reason to believe that Mr. Donovan has a deeper connection to a larger criminal operation than we initially suspected, and we need him in custody for further questioning." Michael's heart sank. Whatever was happening, it was far beyond what he had ever imagined. But as he sat there, watching the FBI agents exchange looks, he knew one thing. He wasn't going to go down without a fight. Whatever was coming, he needed to figure it out before it was too late. The tension in the room thickened. The prosecutor, sensing the shift in power, adjusted his tie nervously. The judge's eyes were calculating, her mind racing as she processed the new information. And Michael? He was caught between two worlds, one where he was just a man trying to live a quiet life, and another, darker one, that was now coming for him with all the force of a freight train. The question was, would he survive it? The room was eerily quiet, the weight of the tension hanging heavily in the air as Michael sat, his mind churning with the implications of what was happening. The FBI had officially entered the scene, and the stakes had just been raised higher than he could have imagined. His mind was racing, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't make sense of it. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom anymore. He was being dragged into a world of conspiracy, one that he wasn't sure he could escape. Agent Reed's eyes were locked on Michael, as if daring him to speak. The prosecutor, for his part, was looking flustered, unsure of how to react to the new turn of events. Michael was sitting between them, the center of an investigation that, up until now, had seemed so simple. A man was accused of assaulting another man. End of story, right? But now, Michael realized, the story had only just begun, and it was far bigger than he had ever anticipated. Just as Michael was about to open his mouth and try to make sense of what was happening, the door to the courtroom burst open once again. Everyone turned in unison, expecting more bad news. This time, the person who entered was not a law enforcement officer or an official figure. It was a woman. A young woman, her face pale, her breath coming in quick bursts as she rushed into the room. She looked panicked, as if she had been running for miles. "I have evidence," she said breathlessly, clutching a piece of paper in her hand. She scanned the room quickly, and her eyes locked on Michael. There was something about the look in her eyes, something desperate, but at the same time, determined. The judge turned her gaze toward the newcomer, her brow furrowing. "And who are you?" Judge Hayes demanded, her voice sharp, a note of annoyance creeping in. The woman hesitated for a second before responding, taking a step forward. "I'm Julia Barrett. I'm a witness, and I know Michael Donovan is innocent." There was a collective gasp from the courtroom, and Michael's heart skipped a beat. He didn't recognize her. He had no idea who she was. But something about her words made his stomach flip. Innocent? Could it be true? Could someone actually step forward and prove that he hadn't been in the wrong? The prosecutor immediately rose from his seat, hands raised in disbelief. "This is absurd," he snapped, clearly flustered by the interruption. "You cannot simply come in here and throw around accusations without any proof. This trial is already in progress." Julia stepped forward without hesitating. "I'm not here to make accusations," she said firmly. "I'm here to present the truth. Michael didn't assault anyone. In fact, he saved a woman's life." The room fell silent. Michael felt as if time had stopped. He couldn't understand what was happening. For years, he had struggled to be seen as more than just a criminal, to prove that he was a different man than the one who had been locked away in prison. And now, someone was standing up, speaking for him. But who was this woman? Why was she speaking for him? "Ms. Barrett, you are interrupting a trial," Judge Hayes said sternly. "Do you have any legitimate evidence to support your claim?" Julia nodded, her hands shaking as she handed the piece of paper to the judge. "I was there that night. I saw everything. Michael Donovan didn't attack anyone. He was defending someone else." The room was still. Even the prosecutor couldn't seem to find words for a moment. The air was thick with uncertainty, and everyone in the courtroom held their breath as Judge Hayes unfolded the paper, reading it quickly. The judge's face remained unreadable as she processed the contents of the paper. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then, slowly, Judge Hayes looked up, her eyes narrowing as she studied Julia. "You expect me to believe this?" she asked, her tone skeptical. Julia met her gaze. "Yes, Your Honor. I do." Michael was stunned. This was the first time anyone had spoken up for him in years. The words, "I know Michael is innocent," kept echoing in his mind. But it didn't make sense. Who was she? Why was she helping him? He didn't even know her name until just now. "Ms. Barrett, I'm not sure you realize the gravity of the situation," the prosecutor spoke up, recovering from his shock. "This man," he pointed at Michael, "was found standing over the victim, and no one else was there to witness what happened. There is no physical evidence to suggest anything other than what we already know." Julia's eyes flashed with determination. "You're wrong," she said. "I was there, and I saw Michael intervene. The man in question," she pointed to the bruised individual Michael had seen earlier, "wasn't the victim. He was the aggressor." There was a sudden stir in the courtroom as people began to whisper among themselves. Michael's heart began to pound in his chest. This was his chance. But even as Julia spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The man in the alley wasn't the victim? That didn't make sense. Michael had fought him, sure, but he hadn't seen him as a threat like this before. There was something more to the story, and now Julia was trying to reveal it. But why was she only speaking now? Why hadn't she said something sooner? Judge Hayes leaned forward, her fingers steepled together, her expression unreadable. "Ms. Barrett, what you're saying is highly unusual. If you were a witness, why didn't you come forward sooner?" Julia hesitated for just a moment before answering. "I was scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know what to do. But I couldn't stay silent any longer. I couldn't let an innocent man go to jail for something he didn't do." Michael felt his chest tighten. Scared? Julia's words rang true. He had known what it was like to be scared, to be trapped by a past that wouldn't let him go. But now she was offering him the one thing he had needed all along: a way out. Judge Hayes looked over at the prosecutor, then back at Michael. "Mr. Donovan," she said, her voice firm, "do you know this woman?" Michael shook his head slowly. No, Your Honor. I've never seen her before. The judge exhaled sharply, clearly deep in thought. We will verify the legitimacy of this new information, she said. But in the meantime, I'm suspending this trial until further notice. Michael couldn't believe it. For the first time in years, there was a glimmer of hope. Julia Barrett, this mysterious woman who had appeared out of nowhere, had given him a lifeline. She had spoken up for him when no one else had. But as the courtroom began to settle down, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. If someone was willing to go to these lengths to set him up, who else was involved? He didn't know yet, but he was about to find out. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, but Michael couldn't focus on the noise. His mind was spinning, trying to process everything that had just happened. Julia Barrett had stepped in, claiming to have seen the truth, claiming that he wasn't the one responsible for what had happened in the alley. Her testimony, if verified, could change everything, could clear his name. But even with this new hope, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't as simple as they seemed. A part of him knew, deep down, that this wasn't just about him. There were bigger forces at play, and Julia was just the tip of the iceberg. As the judge's gavel rang out, declaring a temporary suspension of the trial, Michael felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief, because for the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't trapped in a hopeless situation. But dread, because he knew that the storm was far from over. Mr. Donovan, the judge said, her voice cutting through his thoughts, you are to remain here for further questioning. We will reconvene shortly. Michael nodded slowly, his heart still racing. He wanted to speak, to ask Julia what she knew, but he didn't get the chance. The bailiffs ushered him back to a holding area while the courtroom began to empty, the faces of those present full of uncertainty. Julia was escorted out of the room by a court officer, and Michael could only watch as she disappeared from view, leaving him to wonder if she was his savior or just another piece in a much larger game. As Michael sat in the holding cell, waiting for the next steps to unfold, his thoughts drifted back to the night in the alleyway. He remembered how the woman had screamed, the terror in her eyes. He had acted on instinct, the kind of instinct that had kept him alive through years in prison. But what if this whole thing had been staged? What if he had been used as a pawn in a much bigger scheme? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the man he had fought that night, his so-called victim, wasn't the real victim at all. His injuries were too fresh to be from that fight. Michael had never hit him that hard. Something didn't add up. But what? Suddenly, the door to the holding room opened, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Michael's eyes narrowed when he saw the man in the dark suit. Agent Daniel Reed. The man who had been in the courtroom earlier, the one who had claimed that Michael was involved in something far larger than just this trial. Mr. Donovan, Reed said, his voice smooth but carrying an undercurrent of authority, I'm afraid things aren't as simple as you might think. Michael stood, his fists clenching at his sides. What do you want from me? He demanded. I've told you everything I know. Reed gave him a tight-lipped smile. I'm not here to interrogate you, Donovan. I'm here to make sure you understand the bigger picture. Michael's stomach churned. The last thing he wanted was another lecture from some FBI agent who thought he had it all figured out. But Reed wasn't about to let him off that easy. You see, Reed continued, stepping closer, there's something you don't know about the man you fought that night in the alley. His name is Greg Foster, and he's not just some random thug. He's connected to something much bigger, something far more dangerous than you could ever imagine. Michael's blood ran cold. Greg Foster? The man he had fought was connected to a larger criminal organization? That didn't make any sense. "Who is he working for?" Michael asked, his voice low and urgent. Reed raised an eyebrow. "I'm glad you asked. Foster works for Blackthorn." Michael's mind whirled at the mention of the name. Blackthorn. He had heard whispers about them while he was in prison. A criminal syndicate that controlled everything from drug trafficking to arms dealing, money laundering to extortion. They were ruthless, untouchable. Everyone knew about Blackthorn, but no one talked about them openly. Those who did usually didn't live to tell the tale. "Blackthorn," Michael repeated, the word tasting bitter in his mouth. "I'm involved with them?" Reed didn't answer immediately, but the look in his eyes told Michael everything he needed to know. "Yes," Reed said finally. "You've been caught up in their mess, whether you realize it or not. And now, you're going to help us bring them down." Michael's stomach dropped. The FBI wanted him to help them? He wasn't sure if he was more confused or terrified. He had been a part of their world once, back before he was locked up, but he had severed all ties long ago. He had done everything he could to leave that life behind. And now, here he was, being dragged back into it. No choice, no way out. "You've got it all wrong," Michael said, shaking his head. "I don't know anything about Blackthorn. I've never been involved with them." Reed stepped forward, his eyes cold. "I'm afraid that's not true, Mr. Donovan. You've already made your first mistake by getting involved in that alley fight. You're connected now, and we need you to help us. We're not asking." Michael took a step back, his mind spinning. This was the last thing he needed. The FBI had just come into the picture, and now they were expecting him to do their dirty work? He was supposed to trust them? Before Michael could respond, the door to the holding room opened again, and another figure stepped inside. It was Julia. Reed turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "What are you doing here?" Julia held up her hands defensively. "I just want to help," she said, her voice steady. "Michael didn't do anything wrong. I know he's innocent, and I want to make sure he gets a fair chance." Reed's eyes flicked between the two of them, but he said nothing. For a moment, there was an uncomfortable silence. Then, Julia spoke again, her voice urgent. "Michael, I need to tell you something. There's more to this than just the fight in the alley. You're not the only one they're after." Michael felt his chest tighten. "Who else?" Julia's expression grew serious. "Someone within the FBI is helping Blackthorn, and they've been using you to cover up something much bigger. You're not just a pawn in this game. You're a target." Michael's mind raced. The FBI mole inside the agency? This was worse than he had imagined. And just like that, Michael realized that this was more than just a fight for his freedom. This was a war that had been brewing for years, and now he was right in the middle of it. The words, "Someone inside the FBI is working for Blackthorn," echoed in Michael's mind like a terrible refrain. He felt his breath catch in his throat as the weight of Julia's revelation settled over him. A mole inside the agency? That meant the entire system he had trusted to clear his name could very well be compromised. Everything was falling apart, faster than he could comprehend. Julia looked at him, her face tense with worry. "Michael, you need to be careful. I don't think we fully understand the scope of what's happening. Blackthorn has infiltrated more than just the streets. They've gotten to the FBI. You're in more danger now than ever." Michael shook his head, trying to clear the fog that had descended over him. The room felt smaller with every passing second, as if the walls were closing in. "How is this even possible?" he muttered. "The FBI's supposed to be the ones stopping organizations like Blackthorn, not working with them." Julia was silent for a moment, her face darkening. That's the terrifying part. Whoever's behind this is good. They've made it seem like you're the one responsible for everything, all the while pulling the strings behind the scenes. You've been framed, Michael, and the FBI's involvement just confirms that. Michael's heart hammered in his chest. He was in deeper than he realized, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized he had been nothing more than a pawn in this game, a game that had started long before the night in the alley. Before he could respond, the door to the holding room opened once more, and Agent Daniel Reed stepped in. His presence was like a shadow falling across the room, his eyes hard as stone as they locked on Michael. The air felt thicker now, filled with the weight of impending action. "Mr. Donovan," Reed said, his voice cold, "it's time we had a little talk." Julia stepped forward, eyes narrowing as she moved to stand beside Michael. "You've said enough already, Reed. If you think Michael's going to help you take down Blackthorn, you're wrong. He's not your informant, and he's not your scapegoat." Reed didn't flinch. "You're mistaken, Miss Barrett," he said, his gaze flicking between the two of them. "Michael's involvement is necessary whether he likes it or not. He's already caught the attention of people much more dangerous than you two realize. We can either work together to put an end to Blackthorn, or I can make sure Mr. Donovan spends the rest of his life behind bars. The choice is his." Michael clenched his jaw. This was getting worse by the second. He couldn't just let the FBI drag him into this mess, but at the same time, he knew he didn't have the luxury of time. His gut told him that something darker was unfolding, and if he didn't figure it out soon, it might cost him more than just his freedom. "I'm not working with you," Michael said, his voice steady. "If you think I'll just roll over for you, you've got another thing coming." Reed didn't react to the defiance in Michael's voice. Instead, he took a step forward, lowering his voice. "You don't have a choice, Mr. Donovan. You're already involved. Whether you like it or not, your actions have set something in motion, and I'm not about to let you walk away now." Michael's mind raced, but he could feel the truth of Reed's words. He had already gotten tangled up in something far beyond his control. The FBI was involved, and that meant they could manipulate the situation to their advantage. But what if they were just as corrupt as Blackthorn? What if they were only trying to protect their own interests? The silence between them stretched for a long, uncomfortable moment. Finally, Julia spoke up, breaking the tension. "What do you want from him, Reed? What are you asking Michael to do?" Reed's gaze flickered toward Julia, his expression unreadable. "It's simple," he said, his tone calculated. "I need information on Blackthorn. Michael's actions in the alley have put him in a position where he can give us something that we've been unable to access. He's already seen how they operate. If we can use him to infiltrate them, we might be able to bring them down from the inside." Michael could barely contain his anger. "You think I'm just going to walk into their turf and be some sort of undercover agent for you? After everything I've been through?" Reed's face remained impassive. "You don't have much of a choice. We can either use you to stop Blackthorn, or we can put you back in prison where you belong. And considering the nature of this case, you'd be lucky if you ever saw the light of day again. You're already guilty in the eyes of the law. Your best chance is to work with us." Michael stared at him, weighing his options. He didn't want to trust Reed or the FBI, but if what Julia said was true, then there was more at stake here than just his own freedom. He could either cooperate and try to take down the real culprits, or he could risk everything and fight on his own. Neither option was appealing. Before he could speak, a knock at the door interrupted them. The door swung open, and a new figure stepped inside. A man Michael didn't recognize. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit. and his expression was cold, almost predatory. Michael immediately felt his instincts kick in, warning him that this wasn't someone he wanted to trust. "Agent Donovan," the man said, addressing Reed with an odd level of familiarity. "We need to talk." Reed nodded curtly. "Of course, Agent Blackwell," he said, stepping aside to allow the man to enter the room. "What's the situation?" Blackwell didn't answer immediately. His gaze swept over Michael, lingering for a moment before he spoke again. "There's been a development. We need to reassess our strategy. Someone is pulling strings, and it's worse than we thought." Michael felt his stomach drop. The situation was spiraling out of control faster than he could keep up with. Who else was involved? And how much of this was the FBI trying to cover their own tracks? Julia glanced at Michael, her eyes wide with concern. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice shaky. Blackwell turned to her, his gaze cold. "We don't have time to explain. But know this. If you're involved with Mr. Donovan in any capacity, you're already in danger. The people we're up against won't hesitate to make sure everyone who knows too much disappears." Michael felt his pulse quicken. Disappear? The weight of the threat hung in the air like a storm cloud, ready to break. "Is that a warning or a promise?" Michael asked, his voice tight. "Both," Blackwell replied flatly, his tone chilling. The words landed like a blow. Michael had known he was in deep, but now it felt like the entire world was turning against him. And it was becoming clearer by the second that whoever was behind all of this, the FBI, Blackthorn, or someone even worse, was willing to do whatever it took to ensure that no one uncovered the truth. And if Michael didn't find a way out of this soon, he would be buried in a grave far deeper than the one he had just clawed his way out of. The room was thick with tension. Agent Blackwell's words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Michael stood frozen for a moment, his thoughts swirling. He had expected danger, even violence, but this was far beyond what he had imagined. His instincts were screaming at him to run, to get out of there before things got any worse. But where would he go? How could he escape this nightmare that was closing in around him? Julia's voice broke through his thoughts. "Michael," she whispered urgently, grabbing his arm. "What are you going to do?" Michael turned to look at her. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with concern. But there was something else there, too. Something that told him she wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let him fight this fight alone. "I don't know," Michael admitted, his voice low. "But we need to figure something out. Fast." Before Julia could respond, the door to the holding room swung open with a force that made them both jump. A figure stepped inside, followed by a flurry of movement from several agents. It was as if a switch had been flipped. The calm before the storm was over, and now the storm had arrived. Agent Reed's voice was low, but laced with urgency. "Get him ready to move," he barked, turning toward Blackwell. "We've got a problem." Michael's heart began to race. "What's going on?" he demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. "We've just gotten word that Blackthorn is moving faster than we thought," Reed said, his eyes dark. "They're on to us. We need to get you out of here now." A cold chill ran down Michael's spine. Blackthorn? They were always one step ahead, always watching, always ready to strike. The very fact that they had gotten wind of what was happening in the courtroom meant that things were about to get much worse. Suddenly, Michael heard the unmistakable sound of commotion in the hallway outside the holding room. Footsteps were running, doors slamming. A muffled shout. Then, the unmistakable sound of gunfire. The room erupted into chaos. "Get down!" Reed yelled, pushing Michael and Julia to the floor as the sound of gunshots echoed through the building. People shouted, running for cover, trying to shield themselves from the violence that had just burst into their lives. Michael's heart was pounding in his chest. Gunfire? This wasn't a simple trial anymore. It wasn't just a case or an investigation. This was war. The sound of footsteps grew louder, drawing closer. Then, as quickly as it had begun, everything went silent. The deafening noise of bullets and screaming voices was replaced by an eerie, oppressive stillness. For a moment, Michael couldn't move. He couldn't think. The room was spinning, his mind trying to process the danger around him, trying to find a way out. Then, a voice rang out, sharp and demanding. "Where is he?" a man shouted, the voice carrying authority. Michael's blood ran cold. "They're looking for me." He pushed himself up, ignoring the dull ache in his muscles, and grabbed Julia's arm. "We need to get out of here," he said urgently. His voice was hoarse, his mind still reeling from the shock of the situation. Julia didn't hesitate. She nodded quickly, her eyes scanning the room for any way out. They were cornered, trapped. The back door was locked, the windows too small to escape through. There was no easy way out. Then, the door to the holding room crashed open with a deafening bang. Two masked gunmen stormed inside, automatic rifles raised, their eyes scanning the room like predators on the hunt. Michael didn't have time to think. His instincts kicked in, and before he could even process what was happening, he was moving. He grabbed Julia's wrist and yanked her toward the back corner of the room, pushing her behind a table for cover. Bullets ricocheted off the walls, tearing through the room like a hailstorm of destruction. Michael felt the rush of adrenaline flood his system, sharpening his senses, focusing his mind. The gunmen were moving with precision, sweeping their weapons across the room, searching for anyone who might try to escape. "Stay down," Michael whispered to Julia, his voice low but urgent. She nodded, clutching the edge of the table for stability. Michael's mind raced. He couldn't let them find him. He couldn't let them take Julia either. He needed to move, fast. But there was nowhere to go. Every exit was blocked. Every corner seemed to lead to a dead end. Then, he spotted it. A side door, just behind the gunman, slightly ajar. He could make it. He didn't wait for a second longer. He turned to Julia, gripping her arm tightly. "We're going for it," he muttered. She looked at him, eyes wide with fear, but she didn't argue. There was no time to waste. Michael was already moving, darting toward the door with Julia at his side. The gunmen were still focused on the other side of the room, but Michael knew it wouldn't last. They would turn around any second. He didn't look back. He just ran. He grabbed the door handle, yanked it open, and pulled Julia through it. The hallway was narrow, dimly lit, but it was their only chance. They ran, their footsteps echoing in the silence, their hearts pounding in their chests. Michael didn't know where they were going. He didn't know what they'd find, but he knew one thing for sure. If they didn't get out of there, they were both dead. As they ran down the hall, the sound of the gunfire grew fainter, but Michael knew they weren't safe yet. The building was huge, a labyrinth of hallways and rooms, and there was no guarantee that they wouldn't run into more gunmen. They had to move fast. Michael pushed open a door ahead of them, leading to a stairwell. It was their only option. He led Julia down the steps, every creak of the stairs amplified by the tense silence. They were heading toward the exit, but even as they made their way down, Michael's mind was already racing, calculating their next move. Who else was after them? What did Blackthorn want? And who could they trust? They reached the ground floor, and Michael paused, scanning the hallway. No sign of anyone. Yet. "Stay close," he murmured to Julia. They kept moving, their footsteps light but purposeful, until they reached the back door of the building. Michael pushed it open, and the bright sunlight hit them like a slap to the face. They were out in the open now, but it didn't feel like freedom. Not yet. He scanned the area quickly. No one in sight. But he knew better than to trust their luck. It wouldn't be long before someone realized they were gone. "Michael, what now?" Julia asked, her voice trembling slightly. She was trying to stay calm, but Michael could see the fear in her eyes. "We move," Michael said, his voice steady. "We keep running, and we figure this out." They ran, disappearing into the city streets, blending in with the crowd. For now, they were free. But Michael knew one thing for sure. The fight was just beginning. The streets of New York felt like a maze to Michael. Each corner held a new risk, each alleyway an unknown threat. He wasn't used to running, not anymore. For 6 years in prison, he had learned to survive in confined spaces. But now, out in the open, he had to rely on instincts that had been buried for too long. Julia, still at his side, was trying to keep up, her breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. Michael could tell she was frightened. Who wouldn't be, after everything they'd just gone through? But there was something else in her eyes, too. A determination that mirrored his own. She wasn't just following him anymore. She was right there with him, fighting for the same thing: survival. They kept moving, taking sharp turns through the crowded streets, weaving in and out of pedestrians. Michael's mind raced as he processed everything that had happened in the past few hours. The FBI, Blackthorn, the gunman in the courtroom. It all seemed like a blur of chaos and danger. But one thing had become clear. They were being hunted. Whoever was behind this was determined to find them. And Michael knew it was only a matter of time before the net closed in. "Do you have any idea who those men were?" Julia asked, her voice low as they ducked into another alley, trying to blend in with the crowd. She looked over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to be following them. Michael shook his head, his eyes scanning the area. "No idea. But they were looking for me. I'm not sure why, but I think it's because of Blackthorn." Julia frowned. "Blackthorn? I thought they were just some street gang." Michael shot her a glance. "You have no idea how deep this goes, do you? Blackthorn isn't just a gang. They're an entire criminal syndicate, bigger and more dangerous than anything you can imagine. They run drugs, weapons, money laundering, everything. They're untouchable." Julia's eyes widened. "And you're telling me that you're involved with them? That somehow you've gotten caught in the middle of all this?" Michael exhaled sharply. "I didn't get caught in the middle of anything. They've been after me for a long time. And now they've made their move." They reached another street corner, and Michael slowed his pace, scanning the area for any signs of danger. He was starting to feel the weight of exhaustion in his legs, but there was no time to rest. They had to keep moving. They couldn't stop. Just as they were about to cross the street, a car screeched to a halt next to them. Michael instinctively reached for the gun he didn't have, but before he could react, the window rolled down, and a voice called out from inside. "Hey, Donovan, you better get in, unless you want to end up dead." Michael's heart skipped a beat. He didn't recognize the voice, but there was something about it that felt both familiar and threatening. He turned toward the car, cautiously approaching. A man with a sharp suit and sunglasses leaned out of the window. "Get in the car," the man repeated, his tone almost a command. Julia looked at Michael, eyes wide with suspicion. "Who is that?" Michael didn't answer immediately. He was sizing the man up, trying to figure out if this was a trap. But his gut told him that this was their best shot at getting out of the immediate danger. Whoever this was, they knew him, and they knew exactly where he was. "Trust me," Michael said, his voice low. He grabbed Julia's arm, pulling her toward the car. We don't have a choice. They both climbed into the back seat. The man in the front didn't waste any time. As soon as they were inside, the car sped off, weaving through traffic like a car chase straight out of a movie. Who are you? Michael demanded, looking at the man in the driver's seat. What do you want with us? The man glanced over at him, his expression unreadable. I'm not here to hurt you, Donovan, but we don't have much time. The people you're running from? They're bigger than you think, and they'll stop at nothing to find you. Michael's blood ran cold. Who are you working for? The man didn't answer right away. He focused on the road, his knuckles tight on the steering wheel. Finally he spoke. I work for someone who wants to bring down Blackthorn, and I'm here to help you do it. Julia's eyes narrowed. And why should we trust you? You could be one of them for all we know. The man sighed. I'm not one of them, and I'm not here to play games. You're both in this deeper than you realize. Blackthorn isn't just a criminal syndicate. They have their hands in everything. The FBI, the police, politicians. They've been controlling things for years, pulling strings behind the scenes. And now, they've set their sights on you, Donovan. Michael felt his stomach twist. So, what's your plan? You want to use me as a pawn in your game? The man shook his head. Number. You're not a pawn, but you're the only one who can get close enough to take them down from the inside. They've already made the mistake of underestimating you. Julia looked between them, her voice quiet. What exactly do you want from us? The man's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror before meeting Michael's gaze. I want to help you expose Blackthorn, but we need someone on the inside. Someone who can gather evidence, connect the dots. You, Donovan, are already on their radar. You've already fought one of their men, and they're about to come for you. Michael's mind was racing. They're already on his radar. That meant he was in too deep, too exposed. But if what this man was saying was true, then maybe, just maybe, he could turn the tables. If he could infiltrate Blackthorn, if he could get close enough to expose them for what they really were, he might finally clear his name. But how far would he have to go? How much of himself was he willing to give up to bring these people down? We need to know everything, Michael said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. Everything you've got on Blackthorn. The man nodded. I'll give you the information you need. But you have to do something for me in return. You have to help us bring them down. You have to help us get the truth out. Michael felt the weight of the decision settle over him. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. This was about taking down a criminal empire. The stakes were higher than he'd ever imagined, and now he didn't have a choice. The car sped through the streets, weaving in and out of traffic as Michael sat in the back, his mind racing. Every new piece of information that came to light seemed to deepen the hole he was already in, and now the truth was becoming clearer, dangerously clear. Blackthorn wasn't just a group of criminals operating in the shadows. They had infiltrated everything. The FBI, local law enforcement, even politicians. They had their hands in every pot, pulling strings from behind the scenes. As the man behind the wheel, who had yet to introduce himself, sped through the streets of New York, Michael couldn't help but wonder if this was just another part of the setup. He didn't trust this guy. Hell, he didn't trust anyone anymore. But the way things had been going, he didn't have the luxury of picking and choosing allies. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but the truth was, Michael had no choice but to go along with this. Julia, sitting next to Michael, had remained silent for the last few minutes. Her wide eyes scanned the streets nervously, but she was also trying to absorb the magnitude of what was happening. Michael could see it in her face. This wasn't just some street brawl or petty criminal hustle. This was the kind of thing that could get people killed, and the stakes were higher than either of them could imagine. The man in the driver's seat turned to them, his face serious. "We're not out of the woods yet," he said, his voice low. "Blackthorn doesn't just go after anyone. They don't like loose ends. And right now, you two are very loose ends." Michael stared at him. "What's your angle in all this?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with suspicion. "Why should we trust you? How do we know you're not just another part of Blackthorn's network?" The driver's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. He didn't flinch. "I told you already. I work for someone who wants to take them down. Someone who can't afford to let them keep running things behind the scenes. But right now, I'm the one offering you a way out. I'm offering you the chance to expose them, and you're going to help me do that." Michael leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. What exactly are we supposed to do? Walk into their headquarters, give them a taste of our names, and expect them to just fold? The man in the front seat smiled slightly, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. "Not exactly," he said cryptically. "But you've already crossed their path, Donovan. That's your in. Now, we just need to make sure they don't realize you're playing them." Michael's mind churned. He was already in too deep. His entire life had been defined by bad choices and false perceptions. And now, he was supposed to take down a criminal empire that stretched across the globe? He had to admit, part of him was starting to like the idea. But at the same time, it terrified him. The driver seemed to sense his unease. "I know it sounds crazy," he said, "but Blackthorn is the reason you're here in the first place. They framed you. They used you as a pawn. And now, you're their target. You can't just run from this. You need to face them head on." Michael's fists clenched at the thought. They framed me. They used me. It made sense now. The alleyway incident, the woman he had helped, and then the sudden turn in the courtroom. They had orchestrated it all. And the FBI? They were either too corrupt to see it, or part of the scheme themselves. "How do we start?" Julia asked suddenly, her voice tight with both fear and determination. The driver nodded slowly, as if he had been waiting for her to ask that exact question. "First, we need to find out who you've really been dealing with inside the FBI. There's someone on the inside who's been feeding Blackthorn information. We need to find them before they find you." Michael's heart skipped a beat. He'd been right all along. There was a mole inside the FBI, a rat who was feeding them information. It explained so much. The whole system was working against him. He turned to Julia. "We need to figure out who it is. If we don't, we'll never be able to trust anyone." Julia swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "But where do we start?" The driver glanced at them both. "There's a man named Mason Reed. He's an investigative reporter. He was working on a story about Blackthorn before he disappeared. I think he knew too much. If we can find him, we can get the answers we need." Michael's eyes narrowed. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. "Mason Reed. I've heard that name before." The driver looked over at him. "Reed was digging into Blackthorn. He's one of the few people who could blow the whole operation wide open. But someone on the inside tipped off Blackthorn, and he's been missing for days. We need to find him before Blackthorn does." Michael clenched his jaw. He couldn't afford to waste any time. The deeper they got into this, the more dangerous it became. But he didn't have the luxury of turning back. The pieces were all falling into place now, and he realized just how far he'd fallen into their trap. Suddenly, the car screeched to a halt, and Michael's instincts kicked in. Without thinking, he reached for the door handle, pulling it open and yanking Julia out of the car with him. They both hit the pavement, rolling into a side alley just as a black SUV came around the corner, speeding toward them. "Get down!" the driver shouted as the SUV skidded to a stop. Michael could hear the faint sound of footsteps as the SUV's doors opened. They were coming for them. "Now, go!" the driver yelled, pushing Michael and Julia further into the alley. "I'll hold them off. You need to keep moving." Michael's heart raced, but he didn't hesitate. He grabbed Julia's hand and pulled her down another street, adrenaline coursing through his veins. They ran, and all Michael could think was that they couldn't stop now. If they did, it would be over. Michael and Julia ran through the back streets, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the brick buildings around them. The adrenaline was still pumping through his veins, but every second that passed made him feel like they were slipping further away from safety. Whoever was after them wasn't going to give up that easily. And the farther they ran, the more it became clear that they weren't just running from Blackthorn, they were running from the very system that was supposed to protect them. As they turned another corner, Michael pulled Julia into a narrow alley and pressed his back against the cold brick wall. He could hear the distant sounds of sirens, the thrum of police radios, and the low hum of the city that never seemed to stop. But all that noise only amplified the feeling of isolation, like they were in a battle they couldn't win. "Michael, we need to figure out a plan," Julia whispered, her breath coming fast, her eyes wide with fear. "We can't keep running. Sooner or later they'll find us." He looked at her, seeing the determination in her eyes, but also the fear that was starting to creep in. He knew she was right. Running wouldn't solve anything. They had to confront the people who were chasing them, and more importantly, they had to uncover the truth. "I know," Michael said, his voice steady. "We can't keep running forever. But first, we need to find Mason Reed. He's the key to all of this. If we can get to him, we'll have the leverage we need to expose Blackthorn and the people behind this." Julia nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "But how are we supposed to find him? The FBI's already looking for him, and so are Blackthorn's men. We're running out of time, Michael." Michael clenched his jaw. "We'll find him. We have to." The alley was still and quiet, but the feeling of impending danger was palpable. Michael could almost feel it, like a weight pressing down on his chest. The city, once so familiar to him, now felt like a maze full of traps, and the walls were closing in. "I have an idea," Michael said suddenly. "We need to find out where Reed was last seen. If he was digging into Blackthorn, he might have made contact with someone who can help us. We need to talk to his sources." Julia gave him a hesitant look. "But how do we find those sources? If we go to the cops, it's a risk. If we go to Blackthorn's people, they'll just kill us." Michael exhaled sharply, frustration building. "I don't know, Julia, but we don't have many options left." They stood there for a few more moments, letting the tension settle in the air around them, when suddenly Michael's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, hesitating for a moment before answering. "Hello?" he said, his voice low. A familiar voice came through the line, calm but urgent. "Michael, it's Dylan. We need to talk. Now." Michael's pulse quickened. Dylan was the man who had helped them before, the one who had given them information about Blackthorn. If he was calling now, it meant one thing. Things were about to get even more complicated. "Where are you?" Michael asked quickly, glancing at Julia. "I'm at the East Bay Motel," Dylan replied, his voice filled with urgency. "Get here, now." Michael didn't hesitate. "We'll be there in 5. He hung up the phone and turned to Julia. "We need to move, now." They arrived at the East Bay Motel a few minutes later, breathless and on edge. Michael could feel the tension in his chest, the urgency in every step they took. As they reached the door to Dylan's room, Michael could hear the faint sound of muffled voices inside. It sounded like a conversation, but he couldn't make out the words. Michael pushed open the door without knocking, and both he and Julia stepped inside. Dylan was standing near the window, talking to someone who Michael didn't recognize. A tall, muscular man with a cold look in his eyes. "Michael, Julia," Dylan said, turning around as soon as they entered. "I'm glad you made it." The tall man stepped forward, extending a hand to Michael. "Name's Mason," he said briefly. "I think we need to talk." Michael's heart skipped a beat. Mason? It couldn't be. The man was tall, with a hard jawline and a no-nonsense air about him. His eyes were sharp, and he looked at Michael and Julia as if assessing their every move. But Michael knew this face. It was the face of someone who had been involved with Blackthorn, someone who knew exactly how dangerous this all was. "Mason Reed," Michael said slowly. "You're alive." The man nodded grimly. "For now. But not for long if we don't do something about Blackthorn. They've already found out that I've been talking to you." Michael felt his stomach tighten. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Mason's gaze hardened. "Because I've been on the run. The moment Blackthorn found out I had dirt on them, they started hunting me. And now they know you've been helping me." Michael felt a sense of urgency wash over him. "We need to expose them, Mason. We need to get the truth out. We can't keep running." Mason glanced at Dylan, who nodded. "We've got one shot at this. If we don't act fast, Blackthorn's going to bury all of us." They huddled around a table, the air thick with tension. Mason pulled out a folder, slamming it onto the table. Inside were photos, documents, and a series of notes outlining Blackthorn's operations, connections, and the key players within the organization. Michael's eyes scanned the pages quickly, realizing just how deep the corruption ran. "This is it," Mason said quietly. "This is the evidence we need. If we can get it to the right people, we can blow this whole thing wide open." Michael's heart raced as he absorbed the information. But then, something clicked. He stared at one of the photos in the folder. There, in the corner, standing next to a known Blackthorn associate, was someone he knew. Someone he never thought he'd see in this context. It was Agent Daniel Reed. "He's the mole," Michael said, his voice low, his fingers shaking as he pointed to the photo. "He's the one feeding Blackthorn information." Julia's eyes widened in shock. "The FBI? No wonder they were so quick to push you into their investigation. They knew we'd find this out." Michael's mind was racing now. Everything was falling into place. The FBI, Blackthorn, the courtroom, the gunman. It had all been orchestrated. But with the evidence now in his hands, they had a chance to fight back. That night, Michael, Julia, Dylan, and Mason put their plan into motion. They knew the risk. Once they made their move, there was no turning back. They delivered the evidence to the press, bypassing the FBI entirely. Within hours, the truth spread like wildfire. The next morning, the world had changed. Blackthorn's connections were exposed. The corrupt officials, the dirty agents, everything was out in the open. The FBI had no choice but to act, and they arrested those responsible. But Michael knew this wasn't over. Blackthorn would be back. They always were. But for now, Michael had won. The weight of 6 years of being falsely accused was finally lifted off his shoulders. He had cleared his name. Standing outside the courthouse later that day, Michael looked at Julia, her face soft with relief. He took a deep breath, finally able to feel the weight of freedom. "For the first time in a long time," Michael said, a small smile tugging at his lips, I'm finally living.